In a solemn courtroom, filled with tension and cameras, one unexpected voice changed everything. Not a lawyer, not a judge, but a child. When Pope Francis visited the trial of a controversial orphanage abuse case, no one expected him to pause the proceedings. But when a young boy in crimson robes looked up at him and whispered 3 simple words, the court fell into stunned silence. And what the Pope did next would transform not just the case, but the entire global conversation around justice, mercy, and children's rights. This is a story about truth, power, and the undeniable voice of a child who broke through walls even justice couldn't. Location: International Human Rights Tribunal, Rome. Time: 2:42 p.m., Tuesday. The courtroom was still. The judge reached for the gavel until a boy turned to Pope Francis and whispered, "Please stop hurting us." The courtroom was packed. Rows of wooden benches groaned under the weight of journalists, child advocates, lawyers, and clergy. A soft murmur ran through the room as people flipped notepads and adjusted microphones. Sunlight filtered through high windows, casting long shadows over a floor polished smooth by decades of trials. At the front, a judge in traditional black robes reviewed documents with clinical precision. But all eyes were not on the judge. They were on the child. Emmanuel sat quietly in a chair meant for adults, its cushions too large for his frame. He wore ceremonial red robes, a tradition meant to honor his role as a symbolic witness, a child who had once lived in the orphanage, now on trial. His small hands gripped the arms of the chair. His shoes didn't touch the ground. Beside him, a court-appointed guardian kept one hand lightly on his shoulder. On the other side of the room, attorneys whispered. Cameras rolled. The air felt both sacred and tense, as if holding its breath. Among the observers sat Pope Francis. He had come without public announcement. Word had spread only minutes before the session began. He took his seat quietly, eyes focused, his expression tender and solemn. He wore simple white, without the traditional gold accents. Those close to him said he looked not like a leader watching a proceeding, but like a grandfather trying to understand. The judge leaned forward to speak, voice echoing slightly against the walls. Today's hearing is to consider the admissibility of prior reports submitted under seal. At that moment, Emmanuel turned his head. His eyes locked with Pope Francis. The boy's lips parted, and in a voice not meant for microphones but still heard by all, he whispered, "Please, stop hurting us." The words sliced through the still air. Reporters stopped writing. A priest in the back lowered his head. The judge paused mid-sentence, hand frozen above a stack of papers. The lawyers, the advocates, the entire room, held by the weight of a child's plea. Pope Francis rose slowly. He did not speak immediately. He did not look around the room. He looked only at Emmanuel. Then he walked forward, not toward the bench, not toward the cameras, but toward the boy. Have you ever heard a child say something that broke the room open? Emmanuel had spent nearly all of his 10 years behind the high stone walls of St. Aurelia Orphanage. From the outside, it looked like a sanctuary, ivy-covered, well-funded, endorsed by donors and dignitaries. But inside it had become something else entirely. A place meant for safety had turned into a chamber of silence. There were whispers that reached beyond its gates. Children left hungry, lights turned off as punishment, whimpers behind locked doors. But nothing that could be pinned down, nothing written, no recordings. Only shadows and the kind of fear that teaches even the youngest how to protect themselves with silence. No one had dared to speak until now. Emmanuel had been selected as a ceremonial witness. The court didn't expect testimony. They expected presence. He would be symbolic. A gesture, not a voice. But Emmanuel was never meant to be a symbol. He had lived every day of those stories others had only guessed at. And when his eyes met the Pope's, something shifted in him. He wasn't scared anymore. For months leading up to that moment, Pope Francis had followed the rumors swirling around St. Aurelia. They came through unmarked letters, handwritten notes with trembling script, testimonies whispered through parish networks, volunteers and former staff who hinted but never fully spoke, descriptions of loneliness, cold, denial of hugs and names and light. He had seen this before, in other corners of the world, broken systems with golden gates, institutions that once meant healing, but had forgotten their mission in the quiet corridors of neglect. Some Vatican officials advised caution. They recommended sending an official representative. They urged the Pope to remain distant, to pray, to watch, to wait. But Pope Francis had made up his mind. "I need to see their eyes," he told his aides, "and let them see mine." So he went, unannounced. No papal motorcade, no press entourage, just a man in white, walking into a courtroom to witness something he could no longer bear to hear about second-hand. What he found was a boy in red robes, a child asked to wear tradition like armor, a survivor standing in front of an audience that had been trained not to listen. And when Emmanuel spoke, the room broke open. Because truth doesn't always wait for permission. Sometimes it comes from the smallest voice in the biggest room. Have you ever sensed the truth hiding in silence, and knew it was your job to break it open? The courtroom shifted as the prosecutor stood. Pages rustled. Reporters leaned forward. Even the overhead lights seemed to sharpen. The lead prosecutor cleared his throat, glancing toward the bench. "Your Honor," he began, "at this time, we acknowledge that while numerous reports have circulated, no witness has directly confirmed abuse inside St. Aurelia Orphanage. We defer to the court's discretion regarding next steps. It was the kind of sentence designed to end things, to close a chapter quietly, to move on." The judge reached for the gavel. A low murmur swept through the room as he raised it halfway. Then it happened. Emmanuel had been still the entire morning, too still. His small figure hadn't moved except to blink, but now, slowly, he turned. His eyes found Pope Francis again, and then his lips moved. "Please, stop hurting us." The words barely escaped his mouth. Not shouted, not dramatic. Just a quiet, trembling breath. A line so soft it might have been missed, if the silence hadn't already descended. Every sound in the courtroom vanished. Cameras stopped clicking. Pens froze mid-sentence. The gavel stayed suspended in air. Pope Francis didn't hesitate. He stepped forward. Not in grandeur, but in quiet intention. He bent slowly to Emmanuel's level and looked into his eyes. "Who is hurting you?" he asked gently. Emmanuel's shoulders shook, but his voice did not. He looked down, then back up. "The ones who pretend to protect us." The answer did not echo. It didn't need to. It landed like a bell in water, quiet but undeniable. And somehow, louder than 1,000 accusations. The Pope placed his hand on Emmanuel's shoulder. The boy leaned toward it, not for support, but for acknowledgement. A staff member from the orphanage lowered his head. An advocate clutched her folder so tightly the papers inside bent. The judge slowly set the gavel down. No one moved. The entire room had stopped breathing. What had been a hearing of policies and documents had transformed into something else entirely, a reckoning, No lawyer could object. No camera could frame it fully, because what had been spoken wasn't evidence. It was truth. A truth the room had not expected. A truth no one had dared say. And yet here it was, not as a scream, not as a report, but as a whisper. Have you ever heard something so soft it thundered in your heart? The silence in the courtroom held firm, stretched thin by the weight of a whisper. Emmanuel's words lingered, not just in the air, but in the bones of every person present. And then Pope Francis stood. His white robes shimmered in the soft court lighting, glowing gently as he moved forward. It was not grandiosity, it was presence, the kind that changes rooms before it speaks. He faced the judge. The gavel still rested untouched. "I was here to witness," he began, voice calm but resonant. "But now I must act." The room tensed. Cameras clicked back on. Journalists reached for pens. Pope Francis turned, addressing both the court and those watching across the world. For months, letters came to the Vatican, some unsigned, some smeared by tears. They spoke of Saint Aurelia, not in anger, but in agony. He paused. Those letters were filed, shelved, unopened, not out of malice, but out of disbelief. We did not want to imagine the sacred could hide such sorrow. He held up a small folder, no thicker than a sermon. In this folder are testimonies, volunteer accounts, confessions from caretakers who left and never spoke again, until now. He handed the folder to the court clerk, then turned back to Emmanuel. "The only reason truth hasn't surfaced," he said, "is because it was too small, too scared, too young to be heard." He reached out his hand, and Emmanuel placed his small fingers in the Pope's. Pope Francis led him gently toward the bench. "This is not theater," he said. "This is testimony." The judge leaned back, eyes wide, unsure whether to object or observe. The formality of law stood still beside the clarity of conscience. "Let this child's words," the Pope continued, "carry the same weight as any lawyer's file. Let silence no longer be the strongest voice in the room." He placed Emmanuel's hand on the edge of the bench. A single tear rolled down the boy's cheek, but he did not look away. Then, slowly, Pope Francis reached for the gavel. He turned to the judge. "With your permission?" The judge gave a small nod. Pope Francis placed the gavel in Emmanuel's hand. "Let justice begin here." Emmanuel held the gavel as if it weighed more than he did. And maybe it did, not in mass, but in meaning. The room did not cheer. It did not applaud. It simply watched. Because sometimes the moment is not for reaction. It's for reverence. Have you ever seen the tables turn so completely it rewrote the rules? The photo of Pope Francis and Emmanuel, side by side at the bench, holding the gavel together, swept across the world in minutes. Captured by a courtroom journalist in the perfect moment of stillness, the image radiated more than symbolism. It radiated truth. Pope Francis, a global religious leader, not standing above, but kneeling beside a child. Emmanuel, a boy once ignored, holding the very tool of justice, not in power, but in plea. News stations around the world dropped their lead stories to cover the moment. Anchors blinked back tears as they narrated the clip. Editorials were rewritten on the fly. Some newspapers scrapped their front pages entirely. Headlines blazed across print and digital screens alike. A child's whisper shakes the Vatican. The gavel of grace. Emmanuel's stand. A new chapter begins. The hashtag number sign, "Please stop hurting us," exploded across social media. Within hours, it had been shared in over 40 languages. In cities across 5 continents, landmarks lit up in red, the color of Emmanuel's robes, as a silent show of support. Politicians responded quickly. Leaders in Italy called for immediate audits of all church-run institutions housing minors. Canada and Ireland reopened investigations into historic abuse cases. Brazil's Congress proposed the creation of an independent oversight council for orphanages. In the United States, lawmakers requested a hearing to examine partnerships between religious organizations and child welfare programs. But perhaps the most visible reaction came not from policy, but from the people. Outside churches in Europe, Africa, and South America, protesters gathered in silence. They did not chant. They held candles. Signs read, "Believe the smallest voices." And they weren't there to tear down the gates. They were there to ask the church to open them wider. In Rome, thousands lined the Vatican's outer walls, not with rage, but with reverence, urging reform, accountability, and healing. Pope Francis did not issue a formal press release. He didn't need to. The image had said enough. Still, during his weekly address, he added a single sentence: "If a whisper can move the world, then the church must learn to listen differently." Schools held assemblies. Teachers asked students what justice meant to them. Some drew pictures of a child holding a gavel. Others wrote letters to Emmanuel, thanking him for being brave. Emmanuel, now housed safely with a foster family, gave a single statement through his advocate. "I didn't think the world would care," he said, "but they listened to my whisper." That quote, printed in bold beneath his photo, was shared millions of times. Not everyone welcomed the moment. There were critics, commentators who said the church was pandering, officials who questioned the Pope's judicial presence. But they were quickly drowned out by the chorus of those who had waited too long for someone to speak, and for someone to listen. The Vatican announced the formation of an internal investigative council, led by laity and clergy alike, to review all institutions tied to its name. For the first time, survivors were invited to serve as consultants. More letters arrived at the Vatican, not in anger, but in hope, from orphans, from former staff, from bishops who had turned blind eyes and were now opening them. The world had turned, if only slightly, but it had turned. And it all began with a whisper. Have you ever seen one small voice ripple across the planet? The trial resumed, but everything had changed. Gone was the air of routine legal procedure. In its place was something weightier, more reverent. The judge entered not just as an arbiter of law, but as someone now carrying a burden of truth too long ignored. The silence in the courtroom was no longer a hush of formality. It was the quiet of listening. The judge began the morning not with rulings, but with an order. The investigation into St. Aurelia Orphanage would be fully reopened. That one decision cracked the floodgates wide. More children came forward. At first, just a few, then dozens. One by one, they stepped into the light, no longer afraid, no longer alone. Their stories aligned in haunting detail: punishments in dark closets, meals withheld, names erased, affection replaced with fear. Survivors who had aged out of the orphanage returned to offer testimony. Many had never spoken a word before, but now they stood tall, steadied by the courage of a boy in red robes. International child welfare organizations flew in experts and observers. The courtroom grew crowded again, but this time with advocates, auditors, therapists, and legal watchdogs. Transparency became the new rule. Within weeks, the directors of the orphanage were formally indicted. Multiple staff members were suspended pending further review. The Vatican sent a delegation not of hierarchy, but of humility, trained listeners and justice officers, tasked with ensuring systemic change. New policies were drafted in real time. Background checks were expanded. Whistleblower protections were implemented. A hotline for youth reports was installed, staffed not by police, but by child psychologists. But amid all the reforms and motions, one question remained. What would justice look like? When the time came for final judgment, the courtroom once again filled with media, clergy, families, and silent witnesses. Everyone waited. The judge, now visibly changed by the journey, announced the court's findings. St. Aurelia had failed in its duty of care. Abuses had occurred. Cover-ups had taken place. But now, accountability was underway. Then the judge turned toward the door. Emmanuel walked in, no longer in ceremonial red, this time in a soft gray suit, simple, dignified. His foster family stood behind him, hands linked, hearts steady. He was invited to the front, not to testify, not to plead, to close. The judge reached for the gavel, then stopped. He looked at Emmanuel. "It's your voice that led us here," he said. "Finish what you started." He extended the gavel. Emmanuel's hands were larger now, but still small for the weight of what they held. He took the gavel, paused, then looked around the room. His eyes scanned faces, the broken, the brave, the changed. Then he nodded. With one deliberate movement, he brought the gavel down. The sound rang out not as a command, but as a benediction. Not a sentence, but a beginning. The courtroom erupted in quiet tears, hugs, long exhales. People stood not in applause, but in awe. Justice had not walked in wearing a robe. It had walked in on the shoulders of a child. Have you ever seen justice walk in on the shoulders of a child? What began as a whisper became a movement, and then it became policy. In the weeks following the verdict, as reforms swept through the orphanage system, and officials resigned or were reassigned, Pope Francis summoned the Vatican Council to announce something unprecedented. He called it the Emmanuel Decree. It was a simple document, but its impact was profound. The decree declared that in any Vatican-sanctioned abuse investigation involving children, testimony given by a child, when clear and uncoerced, must be prioritized with the same legal gravity as institutional reports. Silence would no longer be the default. Under the Emmanuel Decree, every diocese was ordered to establish a Child Voice Committee, not just for reporting, but for guiding reforms. Youth advocates and child psychologists were appointed to ensure that children would no longer speak into voids. The Vatican, for the first time in its modern history, opened a child protection center inside its walls. Named in Emmanuel's honor, the center combined legal experts, trauma counselors, theologians, and child welfare officers. It was designed not only to address crisis, but to prevent it. At the opening ceremony, Pope Francis did not cut a ribbon. He walked in with Emmanuel beside him, hand in hand, and simply said, "Welcome to a place where we will finally learn to listen." Emmanuel, now a global figure of quiet resilience, became a youth ambassador for child advocacy efforts. He visited schools, sat on advisory panels, and helped shape new training for priests and nuns entering service in orphanages. He did not wear a collar or preach. He wore a simple pin, a small red ribbon, folded in the shape of a gavel. When asked what his job was, he replied, to remind people that even children remember everything. The Pope began quoting him often in sermons. Once, during a homily on humility and justice, he paused mid-sentence and said, "We must learn from those who have been ignored." As Emmanuel told me, if we want to hear truth, we must first listen to those we silence. That line became more than a quote. It became a creed. Churches printed it on bulletins. Youth groups embroidered it on banners. Victims of past abuse, now grown, carried it like a torch, not as anger, but as affirmation. The media shifted its tone too, no longer just reporting on failures, but documenting transformation. Headlines declared, "A whisper became a law," and "From silence to statute." A small country in East Africa passed its own Emmanuel Law, ensuring child testimony would guide national orphanage inspections. In Argentina, Pope Francis's homeland, public schools began offering annual Youth Witness Days. Inspired by Emmanuel's voice, the United Nations invited Emmanuel to speak at a summit on global child welfare. He did not take the podium. He sat in a circle with other youth advocates and told his story, not to shame, but to build. When asked what gave him the courage to speak, he answered simply, "I saw someone willing to listen." Pope Francis watched the broadcast from a quiet room in Vatican City. He said nothing to his aides, only placed a hand over his heart. A statue was later commissioned for the Child Protection Center. It was not of a saint or a bishop. It was of a small child holding a gavel, one hand outstretched, eyes forward, not in fear, but in invitation. At its base were the words, "From whisper to law." Have you ever seen a whisper become a law? In the months that followed the Emmanuel decree, something rare and remarkable began to unfold. What had started as a trial became a transformation, and what had begun in silence rippled outward into sanctuary. Churches around the world, inspired by the courage of one small boy and the humility of a global leader, began establishing days of listening. These were not ceremonial masses or formal sermons. They were gatherings, sacred spaces carved out for the sole purpose of hearing the voices of children in care. Held in chapels, community centers, and parish halls, these events gave children and teens the mic. Sometimes they told stories. Sometimes they asked questions. Sometimes they just sat and cried. And the adults listened. One child in Belgium said during a session, "This is the first time anyone has ever asked me what I think." In South Korea, a foster teen said, "If the church had listened like this before, maybe I would still have a family." At one day of listening in Brazil, a group of young boys performed a reenactment of Emmanuel's courtroom moment. At the end, instead of applause, there was silence, then tears, then a standing vow, never again alone. Meanwhile, Emmanuel's voice continued to rise, not in volume, but in reach. He was invited to speak before the United Nations General Assembly. The room that had seen presidents and prime ministers now sat breathless before a boy in a soft gray suit. His speech was simple. He did not point fingers. He did not name names. He told his story, and then he said, "You can't fix what you refuse to feel, and you can't heal what you will not hear." The delegates stood. Some wept openly. The interpreter for the Arabic channel paused mid-translation, overwhelmed. A veteran diplomat was quoted afterward saying, "That boy said what we've all tried to write in resolutions for decades." The speech was replayed on screens in classrooms, synagogues, mosques, and cathedrals. NGOs asked to license the transcript. School children sent letters by the thousands. Back in Rome, Pope Francis watched the speech alone in his residence. Aides said he prayed quietly afterward, then left through a side door. He walked, without fanfare, to a small orphanage on the city's edge. No cameras, no robes, no press statement. He sat on the floor with the children and listened. No notepad, no agenda, just presence. This became a habit. He visited orphanages with no warning. Sometimes he brought sweets, sometimes only his silence. But every time he sat lower than the children, a practice he said reminded him to look up when listening. Meanwhile, the original court case, once confined to legal pages and regional outrage, turned into something far greater. Countries without active investigations launched them. Governments implemented anonymous child reporting apps. Entire systems were reevaluated. Faith-based organizations that once denied abuse now began inviting external auditors. Transparency became not a demand, but a desire. The Vatican published a global report titled From Silence to Sanctuary, a blueprint for institutions on how to shift from protection of image to protection of innocence. And through it all, Emmanuel remained steady. He declined most interviews. He said little, but when he did speak, his words seemed to carry more than just his own story. They carried thousands. At a press conference for a new child wellness initiative in Nairobi, a reporter asked what he hoped people remembered about what happened. Emmanuel smiled, small and quiet. That even if you feel like no one can hear you, he said, someone might be listening anyway. Have you ever seen the voiceless become the voice for millions? Today, Emmanuel lives in a modest home with a loving family who makes space for his quiet strength and unwavering sense of purpose. He is no longer the boy in the courtroom. He is a symbol, a bridge, and still just a child who likes puzzles, walks in the park, and warm bread in the morning. But his presence in the world has not dimmed. He continues to travel on behalf of children in care, speaking not just at conferences but in classrooms, shelters, and courtrooms, still catching up to the truth. The courtroom moment that began it all has since been immortalized in bronze. On the outskirts of St. Peter's Basilica, a sculpture now stands titled, "Let the Child Speak." It depicts Emmanuel, not in triumph, but in tenderness, a small hand extended, a gavel resting in his palm, and Pope Francis kneeling beside him, listening. Visitors come from around the world to see it. Some take photos, some pray. Many just stand and absorb its message, that justice does not always roar. Sometimes it barely breathes. In an interview years later, Emmanuel was asked why he had whispered that day. He looked down for a long time before answering, because I thought maybe he'd listen. And Pope Francis did. He listened without interruption, without defense. He listened like the world depended on it. And perhaps it did. Because the world followed. Policy changed, laws shifted, doors opened. But more than that, hearts turned. Ears leaned closer to the ground. People stopped to ask children what they needed, what they feared, and what they hoped. Emmanuel's voice became a litmus test for institutional empathy. His presence, a reminder that justice must begin with listening. He once said in a school in the Philippines, "I'm not special. I was just scared. But I said it anyway." And that courage became contagious. Churches, governments, and communities across the globe created listening circles. Judges in several countries began incorporating child-led testimony as core to hearings involving minors. Educational systems revised how students could safely report mistreatment. The whisper grew, and it never faded. Today, Emmanuel lives his life quietly. He paints, he bakes, he writes poems he rarely shows anyone. But when invited to speak, he always finishes with the same line. Someone is still whispering. Make sure you are listening. Because the most powerful voices don't always echo. Sometimes they wait, and sometimes they change the world. If you believe one small voice can move the halls of power, share this story, because someone is still whispering, waiting to be heard.